Hey everybody! Today we're going to be talking about electrons and energy. So we've already discussed exergonic and endergonic. Exergonic reactions is one in which the products have less energy than the reactants. Delta G is negative and energy is released. An endergonic reaction is one in which the products have more energy than the reactants. But more importantly, an endergonic reaction is not spontaneous, so you need to put in extra energy to make it happen. The enzymes can't change the delta G, they can only change the activation energy. So how do you get a reaction like this to happen? We use something called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. If you remember back to your macromolecules section, ATP is a nucleic acid. It has a nucleotide base, a ribose sugar, and 3 phosphate groups. When you hydrolyze ATP, remember hydrolysis is adding water to break something apart. We can break off that final phosphate. Hydrolysis of ATP releases a lot of energy because all 3 phosphates are negatively charged and they're repelling each other. So they are at a very high free energy state. Remember, energy is released when a molecule changes from a state of high free energy in the reactants to a state of lower free energy in the products. Because there's so much energy holding that last phosphate on, the reactants are at a state of very high free energy. When the bond is broken between them, the products move to a lower energy state than they were before, and energy is released. The products are adenosine diphosphate, ADP. It's di because now there's only 2 phosphates left. A phosphate group, we call this inorganic phosphate, and energy. The energy that is released can either be let off as thermal energy or heat, or we can actually use it to do some work. Let's talk about the work that energy can do. This is a reaction where adding glutamic acid to ammonia gives you glutamine. Is this an example of an endergonic or exergonic reaction? This is an endergonic. You can tell because the delta G is positive. This reaction will not proceed spontaneously. So how do we cause it to happen? Adding an enzyme only changes the activation energy. It can't overcome a positive delta G. Instead, we can complete the reaction in several steps and couple the reaction with a different reaction. In this case, hydrolysis of ATP. ATP is hydrolyzed and the inorganic phosphate is added to glutamic acid. This creates a phosphorylated intermediate. This phosphorylated intermediate is then able to release the phosphate and use that energy to bind to ammonia. Although the reaction of ammonia and glutamic acid to make glutamine is non-spontaneous, the reaction of hydrolysis of ATP to ADP is spontaneous. It releases more energy than is needed for the first reaction. If you add the 2 delta G's together, you can see overall the 2 reactions have a negative delta G. So we can do these types of reactions in the body if we have ATP. The ability of ATP to release energy and become ADP plus inorganic phosphate, which can then accept energy and store it as potential energy in ATP, is a fundamental concept in biology. The cell uses ATP like money. It pays for endergonic reactions by spending ATP. It creates ATP by storing energy that is released from catabolism. And just like you might always need more money, cells are always needing more ATP. So how do we get enough? The energy needed to make ATP is solved differently depending on what kind of organism you are. There are 2 strategies. An autotroph can make their own energy. Auto means self and troph means feeding. They use the light of the sun to synthesize organic nutrients. An example of an autotroph would be a plant or a tree. A heterotroph cannot do this. They have to either eat autotrophs or maybe other heterotrophs to obtain the necessary fuel. Humans are a good example of an heterotroph. We're going to be talking about glucose for this next couple days, so it's a good idea to take a look at this slide. The chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. It has 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The atoms are held together with covalent bonds. And remember, a covalent bond means that the electrons are shared between two atoms. This is a high energy molecule. There is a lot of potential energy, chemical energy, stored in these covalent bonds of the glucose molecule. Remember, potential energy is stored energy. When we break down glucose, we know that it has a lot of stored energy, and then we know that we need that energy. We can release it by burning glucose in the presence of oxygen. However, if we do this, we'll get a huge explosion, and so much energy will be released all at once, the cell won't be able to control the reaction and harvest the energy that's released. Most of that energy will be released as heat to the environment. In order to harness the energy, we must use a multi-step series of reactions to break the high energy bonds and strip electrons from glucose one by one. Yes, you noticed I said harvest the electrons, right? Remember back to the chemistry video, the electrons I am talking about are those ones that were shared between atoms in a covalent bond. Glucose is energy rich, and catabolism of glucose releases a lot of energy. The cell cannot use glucose directly, it must transfer the potential energy, the stored energy in the electrons that make up the covalent bonds of glucose to something the cell can use, which is ATP. ATP is also a form of potential energy, but is one that the cell can easily use. Think about a reaction where I gave you an electron. Electrons are negatively charged. If you receive an extra electron, your charge would become more negative. We call this reduction. You have a reduced charge. The opposite reaction is if you give away an electron. You have given something away that is negatively charged, and so you overall become more positively charged. This is called oxidation. So reduction is a gain of electrons because electrons are negatively charged. You become reduced when you get more of them. Oxidation is a loss of electrons. You have to do both processes together. So you can't take an electron and just throw it into the street. You actually have to give it to another molecule. Energy cannot be made or destroyed. It has to be given or converted to something else. The molecule losing the electron is oxidized. The one gaining it is reduced. This is called a redox reaction or a reduction-oxidation reaction. One easy way to remember this is Leo the lion says grr. So Leo is loss of electrons is oxidation, and grr is gain of electrons is reduction. So we know reduction is a gain of electrons and oxidation is a loss of electrons. And we know that we're starting with glucose. We are stripping glucose of all of its energy. We are going to be removing electrons from glucose, and we have to give them to something. Again, we can't just burn glucose and throw the electrons out. We have to transfer those electrons to something else. We're going to give them to something called an electron carrier. When the electrons are given to the electron carrier is reduced. The electron carriers are kind of like little shuttle buses. They pick up their electron passengers that have been stripped off of the glucose molecule, and then they take those electron passengers and give them to oxygen during the electron transport chain. Once the electron carriers are reduced, they have a more negative charge. Hydrogen ions, which are positively charged, are attracted to them. So therefore, each electron carrier will transport not only 2 electrons, but 2 hydrogen ions as well. There are 2 types of shuttle buses that will transport electrons. This first one is NAD+. This is the oxidized form. As NAD+, it's an empty shuttle bus. It's not carrying any electrons. Once it gains electron, it becomes reduced and it's called NADH. The other electron carrier is called FAD. When this electron carrier picks up electrons, it's reduced to FADH2. Both of these carriers can cycle back and forth between the oxidized and reduced forms. Picking up and dropping off electrons and hydrogen ions. Think back to potential energy. The potential energy of glucose is stored and is released when the covalent bonds between the atoms are broken. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, so that potential energy has to go somewhere. Instead of the energy being lost as thermal energy or heat, the shared electrons in those bonds are picked up by the electron carriers and are kept as potential energy. This means that when the electron carriers have been reduced, they now hold that potential energy. They have been converted to a higher energy state, and because they have extra electrons, they are reduced. This is the overall reaction for cellular respiration. You have C6H12O6, which is glucose, being added to oxygen gas, which is going to give you CO2 and H2O and energy as your products. So glucose is going to be losing electrons. It gets oxidized to CO2. Oxygen is going to be gaining electrons. It gets reduced to form H2O or water. The electrons are taken from glucose, transferred to the energy carriers, and eventually given to oxygen. Therefore, glucose is oxidized and the electrons are given to oxygen, which is reduced to water. In this process, we release lots of energy from the potential energy in the glucose molecule bonds, and we transfer it to usable potential energy in ATP. The breakdown of glucose by the cell to make cellular energy is called cellular respiration. There are 3 phases. They're color-coded in your textbook. The first phase, which will be shown in blue, is glycolysis. This happens in the cytosol. The second phase is the citric acid cycle, and that happens in the matrix of the mitochondria. And in the third phase, oxidative phosphorylation happens across the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Phases 1 and 2 are involved with breaking down glucose, harvesting the potential energy in the covalent bonds, and storing that energy in the electron carriers. The third phase of cellular respiration, oxidative phosphorylation, is where the electron transport chain happens. This is where all of the reduced electron carriers will transfer their electrons to oxygen. The electrons given to oxygen will make oxygen more negatively charged and will attract the other passengers on the electron carrier bus, hydrogen ions. Therefore, oxygen will be reduced and form H2O, or water. That's it for today. See you in class.